International news now.
All right, so we want to start today with a video from the PBS NewsHour that introduces some of the critical elements of this current border crisis. It gives you some sense of the size of this surge and the humanitarian challenges that it poses for the Biden administration. So let's run that clip now.
On the southern border, the challenge of unaccompanied children continues. Today, the U.S. government announced that it's opening an additional facility to house them, bringing the total number of beds to around 14,000. It is the latest move by the Biden administration as it grapples with this latest surge. Our Amna Nawaz is on the ground in Texas with the story.
Morning in Texas's Rio Grande Valley, the center of a growing migrant crisis, as the dramatic increase of unaccompanied minors whom the Biden administration says it won't turn away is leading to scenes like this. Overcrowded border facilities, children and teenagers in tight quarters, thousands being held longer than the 72-hour limit before being transferred to shelters and family in the U.S. These images released today by Customs and Border Protection after weeks of denying the press access to these facilities. As border crossings surge, most people are sent right back to Mexico. Like these families, gathering for a moment of prayer in the city of Reynosa. This food from a local church will likely be their only meal for the day, so kids move to the front of the line. This public park, a short walk from the bridge to the U.S., is now their temporary home.
You don't hang out near the bridge. The bridge is where all the gangs hang out, waiting for people getting sent back.
Jennifer Harbury is a volunteer advocate with a group called Angry Tias and Abuelas. She tries to connect these families with social services and legal help.
For a lot of people, it's not an option to go back to Central America. There was really good reason why they left in the first place. They have nothing left. They gave their last cent to the coyotes to get them across, and were dumped back. They have no clothes, no food, no transportation money, nothing.
They pack into this gazebo at night, parents sleeping on top of kids to protect them. Stories of child kidnappings by gangs are rampant, and there are young children everywhere, as young as 7 and 8 years old, some younger. Many of their parents are surprised, they say, to find themselves among the tens of thousands expelled every month by U.S. officials after trying to cross the border, under a Trump-era pandemic rule kept in place by President Biden.
Has anyone actually heard Biden say the border is closed?
Not a single person had. In fact, many had heard that Biden promised no deportations, that young children would be allowed in. They say Mexican authorities have offered no help, though when we show up with cameras, they suddenly appear.
Within minutes of us arriving, a police car pulled up with the sirens going. He immediately got out, started to take pictures of us and of everyone around here. There's a lot of concern here about coordination between the state police and law enforcement and the cartels. So tensions are a little high. We've been advised by our local team here not to spend very long, but we do want to try to talk to a few people and hear their stories.
Denise left Honduras a month ago after back-to-back hurricanes devastated his home at the end of 2020. He brought his 5-year-old son, Denise Jr., with him. He doesn't want to be identified for fear of the gangs. Ada Rosa fled Honduras with her 14-year-old son, Axel, after his older brother was killed in front of them.
She brought with her documentation to prove that her son was killed. This is the death certificate, it looks like. She carried all this with her to try to help make her case.
Axel tells us his biggest fear now is being kidnapped. It's all too much for his mother, who saw the U.S. as a refuge.
I thought they were going to protect me. Instead, they sent me back here.
They understand how dangerous Reynosa is, and they don't know how to get out of here. They can lie down on top of their kids and hope to keep them alive, which is not looking good. Or they can send them alone across the bridge as unaccompanied minors. Almost everybody there was asking me if I send my 10-year-old across, a little girl or my 12-year-old boy, what happens? But it's better than here. So they're going through some really hard soul searching right now. They don't want their kids out of their sight. They love their kids. They're just in agony over this.
Okay, so there's a lot of moving parts to this situation, and so let me offer a few points to emphasize. First, we need to begin by noting the humanitarian concerns here. unaccompanied minors are kept for long periods of time in the United States in facilities that are just not meant to house kids. And this is against the law, current law in the United States that requires that children crossing the border are only allowed to be kept in these temporary holding facilities for 72 hours. And of course, children are particularly vulnerable without their parents in these situations, vulnerable to kidnapping, violence, and simply starvation, dehydration, all of the things, because it's very difficult for them to take care of themselves. And so that is the first thing, that this is a humanitarian crisis first and foremost, and that the United States, and especially in the Biden administration, feels a particular obligation to address this humanitarian crisis. Now, second, we need to note the push factors at play here that are driving individuals, both adults and children, out of the Central American countries in particular, to the United States. People are fleeing really dangerous conditions in their home countries. And some are fleeing gangs that pose a threat to their lives. There's violence, there's poverty, there's climate change. There were a series of hurricanes that devastated these countries in Central America. And so they are fleeing really dangerous conditions. And the journey itself is a problem as well. It's perilous, it's dangerous, and those who are traveling are vulnerable to kidnapping by cartels in Mexico. Okay, so we got the humanitarian crisis and the push factors that are driving people to take on these risks that we don't really want them to take on because the journey is dangerous, but they don't really see any viable options of staying in their home country. Now, the third part of this situation is that there is a bottleneck in Mexico that is part of the problem and a part of the reason behind this current influx of asylum seekers. And this doesn't get quite as much attention by the media. Asylum seekers, have been waiting in Mexico since the Trump administration enacted their Remain in Mexico program. And this program was designed to end what was the previous policy in which asylum seekers were allowed to come into the country and remain in the country while they were having their asylum case processed and heard. Under the Trump administration, they ended that policy and instead made people wait in Mexico to have their asylum cases heard. And this caused, again, some humanitarian concerns because the conditions in Mexico where these people were required to wait for their asylum cases to be processed were not ideal and caused violence and poor living conditions, lack of water and food and the rest. And so because of that policy under the Trump administration, there was a pent-up demand of thousands of people sitting in Mexico trying to get their asylum cases heard and trying to get into the United States. And that led to, or at least contributed to, this influx of unaccompanied minors coming across the border. Now, fourth, another potential explanation for the surge, especially of unaccompanied minors, is a shift in expectations about how the newly elected administration of President Biden would handle these accommodation requests. Despite U.S. officials saying that the border is closed, there are individuals coming to the United States that believe otherwise. So the shift in administration is changing expectations about how asylum requests will be handled and encouraging more individuals to present themselves at the border to border agents and declare themselves to be asylum seekers. And so that change in administration is part of the issue as well. And fifth, there are some consequences, in particular, of President Biden's policy changes on unaccompanied minors. So there has been a change from the Trump administration, which did not allow unaccompanied minors into the United States to have their asylum cases heard, but instead made them wait in Mexico. By allowing unaccompanied minors only to enter the United States and remain in the United States, the Biden administration could be incentivizing and encouraging families to separate parents from minors before they reach the border. And this paradoxically increases the number of unaccompanied minors because some people calculate that separation prior to getting to the border and giving yourself up is better than remaining in limbo in Mexico and not knowing if you're ever going to make it into the United States. And so the end of that clip that we just showed really highlights this dilemma that parents face. They don't want to let their kids out of their sight. They don't want them to be unaccompanied when they go to the border. But because that's the only way that individuals are getting to come into the United States, they might be willing to take that risk. And so those are all of the factors at play in the current situation. So let's now step back and provide some historical context on this recent surge. So Pat, is this surge of unaccompanied minors something new? Is it a crisis?
So in order to answer those questions, let's first try to get a handle on the numbers to create some historical perspective. So let's go ahead to the next slide. And so there is a rapid increase in the number of unaccompanied minors that are requesting or presenting themselves for asylum at the U.S. border in 2021. In October of 2020, when Trump was still in office, there was 4,821 encounters. That's what Customs and Border Patrol, their data, it describes an encounter as either an apprehension, an expulsion, or the declaration of someone as inadmissible, where they don't let them into the country. So there's about 4,800 encounters between border officials and unaccompanied minors in October of 2020, when Trump is still in office. In February of 2021, after Biden takes office, there's about 9,500 encounters between border officials and unaccompanied minors. So these numbers have doubled in the last 4 or 5 months. It's important to realize, though, that this is a relatively small number of individuals. If we look at the number of people that have come in contact, non-residents of the United States that came in contact with U.S. border officials during those times, those numbers are closer to 80 or 90,000 a month. So in October of 2020, over 63,000 single adults were apprehended by border officials and not allowed into the United States. And that number increased slightly to about 71,000 in February. So the growth here is in unaccompanied minors. And it's important to realize, right, as you'll see in future clips from President Biden, the border remains closed to adults and families. Adults and families that present themselves to border officials are turned away and continue to be held in Mexico under the Remain in Mexico policy that President Trump enacted with cooperation with the Mexican government. President Biden is still implementing that policy. The second thing we need to realize here is when the media talks about this as a crisis, what they are referring to in terms of the inability right now of U.S. Customs and Border Protection to house unaccompanied minors. So the CBP facilities were built to house adults under armed guards really close to the border, where there's determination then made about what to do with them. Unaccompanied children are not supposed to be held in these facilities for longer than 72 hours, right? Then what's supposed to happen under U.S. immigration policy is unaccompanied minors are held for no longer than 72 hours. And again, these conditions there are more like jails than they are for, say, facilities that are meant to house kids, which are instead designed to be run by Health and Human Services. What's the difference in these facilities? Under Armed Guard in Border Patrol facilities, under Health and Human Service facilities, kids have access to schools, they have access to counselors, they have access to play areas, regular meals, right? So this surge of unaccompanied minors left the border facilities run by Customs and Border Patrol overrun, and there was limited capacity at Health and Human Services because of COVID. They had been limiting capacity at these secondary facilities because of COVID and social distancing rules. Well, they've relaxed those restrictions in the last month or so. Now, and the purpose of this is, so basically, if an unaccompanied minor comes and presents themselves, there's a staging to this process. First, they are held temporarily for what's supposed to be up to 72 hours in Customs and Border Patrol area. Then they're moved to facilities run by Health and Human Services, again, with schools, counselors, play areas, support, social and mental support, access to doctors. Then Health and Human Services and social workers in these facilities, then they hold these unaccompanied minors until they can place them with family members inside the United States, and they have to confirm that they are in a safe environment with family members. In prior presidencies, Health and Human Services has released these kids too early without confirming that they have family members present, and they've ended up in forced labor situations in, I believe, Ohio. And so Health and Human Services is designed to protect these kids to make sure that they get them into a safe environment. Okay, so let's step back now. Why are these children presenting themselves to border agents? And I think it's important to realize here is these kids are intentionally presenting themselves to border agents. They're not trying to secretly get past Border Patrol and inside the United States. Why is that case? Because they are officially, this is the legal process by which they request asylum inside of the United States. And what is this thing called asylum? Well, we're going to take some language here from the Immigration and Nationality Act. The U.S. can grant asylum or refuge if a person is unable or unwilling to return to a country of origin because they have suffered past persecution or as a well-founded fear of future persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So this is about freeing or escaping horrible conditions in another country and seeking the United States, seeking refuge in the United States. There's a legal process. So they present themselves as requesting asylum, and then there's an investigation undertaken by the U.S. government to see if these claims are well-founded and they deserve asylum. All right? So legal process designed to grant protection to people being persecuted inside other countries. All right, so let's go back now to the question about why is this surge happening. Rob already talked about it a little bit. We're going to give you some more examples of this, and please note that this list is preliminary. And it's important to realize that the debate about the sources of the surge is necessarily political in the news. It's debated in political terms in the news because each explanation is simultaneously an argumentative device to blame someone else for the surge. So yesterday, President Biden did his first main news conference. He was asked about the surge at the border, and how did he explain it? He said this is about seasonality, that the U.S. has faced these surges in the past. They usually come in the winter and spring months because it's too dangerous in the summer. And so what he's saying is, and there is some evidence in this, and we'll show you this shortly, that this happens every year. There's a surge about this time because of climate, because of seasonal changes make it safer to try to do the crossing now. And so what Biden is saying here is nothing new here. This isn't a crisis, we can handle it. All right, a second explanation here is that the surge is a function of the Remain in Mexico program, that there were these bottlenecks in Mexico of people from Central America that had presented themselves for asylum during the Trump administration, say dating back to the surges in 2018 and 2019. And so the reason that there's a surge now, and Biden talked about this in his press conference, or the claim here is that it's a function of the failed policies of the Trump administration that left people in Mexico in dangerous conditions, more vulnerable to the cartels. And so now they're surging to the United States because of past decisions, past policies enacted by Trump. And so what Biden is trying to do with this explanation is to say, well, no, this isn't my fault. This is Trump's fault. We've got to talk as well about worsening conditions, and Rob already mentioned this, in sending countries. We've got economic collapse, COVID epidemic, state failure to provide basic public goods. Again, one of the standard stories is that people are fleeing with their children to escape the gangs. And then we also have to take seriously the claim that it's the shift in administrations, that there is an expectation that border enforcement will decline under Biden, or that Biden will enact policies that are more friendly or more favorable to immigrations, and that this is leading to more people presenting themselves for asylum in the United States on the southwestern border. And it's important to recognize here that there's a tangible policy change that can also explain this, which is Biden is now allowing entry for unaccompanied minors seeking asylum. Well, surprise, surprise, more unaccompanied minors are presenting themselves for asylum because now they can get in where they couldn't 4 months ago. All right, so let's give a little bit more historical context on these numbers, and so we can get some sense of how different or how similar that this surge in the last couple of months is relative to the past 7 years. And so the next slide is going to provide a figure indicating the monthly number of asylum requests, the average monthly number of asylum requests since 2013, right? And we can see here there's been 3 significant surges during the past 7 years. The first occurred under President Obama in the spring of 2014. And at that time, there was about 60,000 people per month requesting asylum at the southwestern border. The second pronounced surge began during the Trump administration in the spring and summer of 2018, and then peaked in May of 2019. And at that point, border officials were processing over 130,000 requests for asylum per month. So it's important to realize that surge in May in 2018 and 2019 was more pronounced than the surge facing the United States today, right? And in the present surge, about 96,000 people presented themselves and requested asylum at the southwestern border in February of this year. The bulk of them, again, this is important, over 80,000 were single adults and families. They were all turned away and told to remain in Mexico while their asylum claims were processed, right? This is what it's important to remember, right? We talked about how Biden is letting unaccompanied minors in. At the same time, there's lots of continuity in U.S. policy towards asylum requests from Trump to Biden, because the majority of them, single adults and families, are all held outside of the United States while their asylum claims are being processed in the United States. So what's different than in 2021? First, we've got this growth in unaccompanied minors. It's important to realize most of the unaccompanied minors are of the ages 15, 16, and 17. There is a greater proportion of these unaccompanied minors from Mexico in 2021 than in prior surges. There were more in 2018 and 2019 from the Central American countries than there were from Mexico. But this year it looks like a greater surge from Mexico. Also part of the asylum requests this year, it's fewer families are presenting themselves in 2021 relative to 18 and 19, and many more single adults are presenting themselves in 2021. All right, so Rob, part of the backstory behind all of the recent surge has to do with COVID. It helped curb asylum requests last year and provided the legal foundation for the Trump and Biden administrations to force asylum seekers to remain outside of the U.S. while their claims were processed. Can you tell us a little bit, Rob, about what Title 42 is and what it has to do with all this?
Sure. So this is a big part of the story, and it's a different part of the story in the sense that it's a lever used by both the Trump administration and the Biden administration to keep people out of the United States while they try to get their asylum petition granted or at least heard. And so the border on the southwest of the United States, between the United States and Mexico, it remains largely closed to adults and families in 2021 under the Title 42 provision. So what is the Title 42 provision? This provision is based on a 1944 public law statute that closes the border to non-essential travel in the case of a public health emergency, right? And so this provision, so this long predates the current crisis. It long predates COVID-19 for that matter. This provision, Title 42, accounts for 80% of the expulsions out of the United States back into Mexico in 2020. It was the reason that was used. COVID-19, public health emergency, was what the Trump administration used to validate their decision to keep people out and send people back to Mexico. And the Biden administration has left this Title 42 restriction intact for the vast majority of asylum seekers and immigrants that are trying to get into the United States. And so the only relaxation of the Title 42 restrictions is for unaccompanied minors. Everyone else, because of COVID-19, because of the CDC ruling that COVID-19 is a public health emergency, are not allowed to remain in the United States. And so in March of 2020, the CDC declared that asylum requests would be denied because of a public health emergency associated with COVID-19, and that they would not be allowed to remain in the United States, but would be sent back to Mexico. And so because of this provision of US law, asylum seekers are no longer able to live in the United States while their asylum claims are processed. And that hasn't changed from President Trump to President Biden, except for one crucial small category of asylum seekers, and that is unaccompanied minors. And so now we're going to move on from this particular policy, which has provided the Biden administration some lever to keep a vast majority of asylum seekers out of the United States, so it's not an even larger influx of migrants into the US. And we're going to talk about the history of this issue in the United States through a comparison of US policies for controlling the Southwest border under Presidents Obama, Trump, and Biden. And we're going to rely on a couple of clips from the New York Times The Daily podcast to introduce the policies of President Obama and President Trump. And so let's go ahead and listen to the first one of these that examines the surge of unaccompanied minors in 2014 under President Obama. So let's go ahead and run that clip.
Okay, so in order to put what Biden is doing and may be doing in the future into some context, help me understand those two previous moments at the border, these surges in unaccompanied minors, and how Presidents Obama and Trump responded to them. And let's start with President Obama in 2014.
Okay, sure. So the number of unaccompanied children that were crossing the border in the Obama administration, it caught the administration flat-footed.
The flood of children has become a crisis for the government as it scrambles for solutions.
Eventually, you would see the Obama administration respond, which actually President Biden was the face of.
Joe Biden is in Guatemala today, meeting with Central American leaders. He's hoping to get their help in stopping the surge of unaccompanied minors arriving in the U.S.
Of trying to invest in Central America, invest around $750 million to get at those root causes. You also saw them create a program in the Central American region where children could apply for protection remotely. However, you also saw an administration that really wanted to show that they could control the border.
Today, the grand opening of a new South Texas immigrant detention facility.
And what they did in order to do that was actually expand their detention capacity.
The largest immigration detention center in the country has just opened a 50-acre facility, just 85
constructed new facilities, turning to tent facilities to house migrants.
The facility will imprison mostly women and children from Central America.
And that combined with really an increase in deportations under the Obama administration prompted widespread backlash.
So the Obama administration, it sounds like, was using two strategies that were somewhat at odds in an effort to control the border. One is to make investments in these countries where people are migrating from to try to stem the problems that triggered the migrations. But the second part of that strategy is harder edged, and it involves detention.
That's right. And that's where you saw a lot of that criticism. I mean, by law, children are supposed to be moved out of these Border Patrol facilities within a couple of days. They're supposed to be kept in sanitary and safe environments. And the administration got criticized for holding kids too long in some of those detention facilities.
And was that criticism justified?
Yes. I mean, you had migrant children that were being held beyond the 72-hour mandate that they're supposed to be held. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you would see even more of a strategy of deterrence and what many would call cruelty in the next administration.
Okay, so the Obama administration took a two-pronged approach to controlling the border on the southwest of the United States. So the first part of this was to invest in trying to solve the root cause of the push factors that are driving people from the Central American countries into Mexico and ultimately into the United States. And he sends Joe Biden as vice president to Central America to try to facilitate an increase in foreign aid, about $750 million to the Central American region, to build up state capacity and to reduce the outward pressures for immigration there. And so he basically is investing money in these Central American countries to try to pay for citizens to stay in their countries rather than flee terrible conditions and come to the United States. But the second half of this two-pronged approach was increased enforcement of border control through a growth in detention capacity. And so the Obama administration pushed deportations up. They got tough on expelling individuals who crossed the border without any documentation. And so this strategy by the Democratic Party under the Obama administration was an attempt to get some cooperation from Republicans and get some approval from the general public for more admissions under asylum and other conditions, but by simultaneously getting tougher on enforcement measures to control an influx of migrants at the border. And so now let's move from this summary of the Obama administration's policies to those of the Trump administration in 2018 and 2019. And we're going to start with this second segment from the same daily podcast on the Trump administration. So let's run that clip.
So tell us about how the Trump administration handles a surge of unaccompanied minors at the border under its watch.
Well, look, the Trump administration's approach to the border was centered on deterrence.
Immigration is the fault and all of the problems that we're having.
Discouraging families from coming to the border.
Right.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. Won't be.
The best way that I can summarize his approach is that actually he squeezed the system from both sides.
What do you mean?
So on the front end, the Mexican side of the border, the Trump administration actually instituted policies that limited the number of asylum seekers that could go to the ports and ask for protection. Mm-hmm. So he makes it more difficult for them to get in. But once they are in, once you have an unaccompanied child who's brought to a border facility and then subsequently brought to a shelter managed by Health and Human Services, he actually made it also more difficult for them to be released on the back end of the system. In order for an unaccompanied child to be released, you would need a relative to come forward and be their sponsor. But the Trump administration implemented policies that many would say actually discouraged those relatives from coming forward. That includes requiring fingerprints, increased background checks for everyone in that immigrant household. That combined with a general rhetoric around increased deportations, an increased fear of deportations. So that's what I mean when I say he squeezed squeezed the system from both sides. He made it more difficult for these unaccompanied children to get out of these facilities. And the result is these children end up stuck.
Whose approach was seen as the most effective in confronting these two surges of unaccompanied minors, Obama's or Trump's?
Well, look, there's no question. If your measure of success is keeping asylum seekers out of the country, keeping them south of the border, preventing them from crossing into the United States, there's no question that Trump did that. He got to the point where he effectively sealed the border to asylum seekers. And he went so far as to actually turn to a new policy in March of last year. A public health emergency rule rooted in the coronavirus pandemic was introduced. Now, what this did is it empowered agents and officers along the border to essentially rapidly turn away, the legal term is expel, migrants who cross the border into the United States. And this included children who crossed the border alone. Now, the administration said at the time that this was necessary to prevent the coronavirus from spreading in facilities, but there was a cost. For one, our reporting showed that even children that were from Central America at times weren't expelled to their home country, but were instead expelled to Mexico, sending their families into a scramble to search for them. They're in Mexico now, and in some places they were forced to be in these squalid areas that were subject to violence and kidnappings from the cartel. So there was certainly a cost to this. At the same time, this rule allowed Trump to achieve one of his goals that he had long wanted, sealing the United States to those seeking protection in the United States.
All right, so let's talk about the Trump surge, or I should say the surge in number of asylum requests during the Trump administration in 2018 and 2019. The first thing to remember is, these border apprehensions, they spike in May of 2019. And if you remember that graph going back over the last 7 years, that was the largest number of people presenting themselves ever, or in the prior 7 years during the Trump administration. In 2019, most of the people requesting asylum were families. So 2/3 of border crossings in 2019 were done by families seeking political asylum in the United States. 90% of these families in 2019 were from Central America. So how did the Trump administration respond to this surge? It responded by making it harder to get into the United States, tightening restrictions on asylum, reducing the size of asylum quotas, cooperating or partnering with the Mexican government through the Remain in Mexico program, so that people presenting themselves for asylum had to remain in Mexico while their claims were processed rather than being released in the interior of the United States, which had been done prior to 2018, say during the Obama administration. There is a reliance in the Obama administration on a strong deterrence policy to try and prevent people from presenting themselves for asylum claims or trying to cross the border. An example of this is the 2018 zero tolerance policy, the famous policy that made the decision to prosecute parents for illegally crossing the border. This policy was in place during the summer months of 2018. So if parents crossed the border with their children, they were prosecuted for breaking the law, and this prosecution triggered a separation between the parents and children. This became a big issue in the 2020 campaign, and Biden said on day one, I'm going to sign an executive order because there were still children that had not been reunited with their parents after being separated in 2018. So during the Trump administration, strong reliance on deterrence, on getting tough. And you can add the border wall policy to this as well, which was designed to prevent people from trying to gain access to the United States. And again, this creates a significant bottleneck of asylum seekers in Mexico waiting to get to the United States. All right, so now let's fast forward and let's talk a little bit about what President Biden has done in his first couple of months in office. And so we're going to rely on a recent interview with George Stephanopoulos of ABC to talk about some of his policy changes with respect to immigration. Let's run that clip.
Let's talk about the crisis at the border. Some heartbreaking scenes down there right now. And a lot of the migrants coming in saying they're coming in because you promised to make things better. It seems to be getting worse by the day. Was it a mistake not to anticipate this surge?
Well, first of all, there was a surge the last 2 years in 19 and 20. There was a surge as well.
This one might be worse.
No, well, it could be, but here's the deal. First of all, the idea that Joe Biden said come, because I heard the other day that they're coming because they know I'm a nice guy and I won't do what Trump did.
This.
Yeah. Well, here's the deal. They're not. The adults are being sent back, number one. Number two, what do you do with an unaccompanied child that comes to the border? Do you repeat what Trump did? You take them from their mothers, to move them away, hold them in cells, et cetera? We're not doing that. So what we're doing is we have brought in HHS and also brought in FEMA to provide for enough safe facilities for them to get out of the control of the Border Patrol, which are not designed to hold people for long periods of time, particularly children, get them out of those facilities. And most of them come with a phone number. So what we're doing is we're putting together an entire organizational structure so that within 7 days they're able to get in the phone, contact that number, find out whether there is a mother or a father, whether it is safe, whether it is a secure circumstance to get the child to that adult.
It's going to take some time, though, to get those policies in place again. Do you have to say quite clearly, don't come?
Yes, I can say quite clearly, don't come. And what we're in the process of getting set up, and it's not going to take a whole long time, is to be able to apply for asylum in place. So don't leave your town or city or community. We're going to make sure we have facilities in those cities and towns run by DHS and also access with HHS, the Health and Human Services, to say you can apply for asylum from where you are right now. Make your case. We'll have people there to determine whether or not you are able to meet the requirement you qualify for asylum. That's the best way to do this. In addition to that, while we also change the circumstances on the ground in those communities, you're going to diminish the reason why people want to leave in the first place.
Okay, a couple things I want to highlight here. First, we see the political blame game here, right? There wants to be some blaming of Trump. Prior policies draws the comparison between humanitarian concerns about protecting children, right, and how it was morally objectionable. That's essentially what he's arguing, that what Trump did in terms of separation. He's saying we've got to do something with the children now, something different. We also see the seasonal argument that this happens every year, right? And so this is seasonal climate patterns. In other words, it's not a function. He's trying to distance himself and say this is not a function of my change in policies, which really aren't that different, because he's saying we're still keeping most adults and families out, but we are, for moral reasons, going to be more hospitable to children. The other thing, and we're going to talk about this shortly, I want to emphasize here is the importance of cooperating with other governments in terms of if the Biden administration really wants to get at the root causes here, it has to construct cooperative arrangements with other governments that allows people to remain in their home countries and have their asylum requests to get to the United States processed there. He's hoping that that will reduce some of the pressures to get to the United States. One thing to think about in this might be a risky proposition for these people if they fear for their lives and are facing persecution or threats from the gangs. The last thing that they're going to want to do is remain in their country. And so one of the things to think about when you hear this proposal from Democratic administrations is how are they going to solve the protection problem for these people on the ground if they're asking them to remain within Central American countries. All right, so in the final segment for today here in the last 10 minutes or so, we want to discuss some of the domestic and international political challenges facing the Biden administration as it confronts this surge. So Rob, can you talk a little bit about the present political reality in the United States on immigration, and what role does partisan conflict play here?
Okay, so the first point to be made about partisan conflict here is that we are currently stuck in a sort of equilibrium that has lasted for quite a while, predated the Biden administration, for sure, in which there's a status quo that in which Democrats and Republicans voice strong opposition to each other, and they block the preferred policies of the other party. And so nothing really gets done on immigration reform because there isn't some sort of consensus policy package of proposals that can get majority support in both houses of Congress and from the president so that it can become law, right? And so there's such a wide separation right now between the Democrats and the Republicans on this issue that it's really hard to see meaningful immigration reform passing through legislation, at least. And like I said, this has been this situation for quite some time. This was one of the reasons that the Obama administration and President Obama issued executive orders on immigration, like the DACA program to protect dreamers, right? Young individuals who were brought across the border without their full approval and control as children, being protected from deportation, right? And so what you have here is this partisan divide. Now, Biden and the Democratic Party support new legislation that offers a path to legal residency and eventually citizenship for some segment of undocumented individuals that are currently living in the United States. And this partial bill in Congress for dreamers, the protection of these DACA individuals and agricultural workers has been passed by the House of Representatives and could go to the Senate, but is going to have a much harder time getting through the Senate. Now, President Biden also wants to increase asylum and refugee quotas, which would increase immigration through that avenue in the United States. But there is staunch opposition to this package of proposals for protecting dreamers and agricultural workers and providing a path to citizenship for those groups and increased asylum and refugee quotas from Republicans. And the truth of the matter is that Donald Trump has remade the Republican Party, and there's widespread support within the Republican Party for the exact opposite approach, restricting and tightening control of the border, reducing legal immigration, and reducing the number of political refugees and asylum seekers that are let inside of the United States every year. And so the partisan divide is great, and the likelihood for a legislative solution to this is really low. So Pat, can you talk a little bit more about how the Republican Party views immigration and how those views have evolved?
Sure, and I think it's important to realize that for economic reasons, in the past there has been some support for increasing immigration levels into the United States on the part of the Republican Party. In the partial or the bill that Rob just talked about, making its way through the House, that offers legal residency and a path to citizenship for DACA workers and increases the number of agricultural workers inside of the United States that have legal status. It looked like there was going to be some Republican support for this partial bill that I want to say affected maybe about, and correct me if I'm wrong here on the numbers, Rob, 2 to 3 million undocumented individuals. It looked like there was going to be Republican support in the general store, right? And there was support from Republicans in agricultural districts. Businesses wanted to reduce these restrictions on labor. This was help to push down costs and wage costs. So it looked like there was going to be some support. The recent border surge in the last 2 months has made this a non-starter for Republicans. And basically, I think Lindsey Graham did a press conference last week or the week before. He said, yeah, this ain't going anywhere with Republicans right now, given the surge going on. And so This is also why this surge is important, because it's changed political calculations within the Republican Party. There was a willingness to come part of the way towards the Democrats until about 3 weeks ago, and that's done. And it's probably not going to happen now until after the midterm elections. The other thing to realize too, I think, about kind of Republican strategy on this, and what they're doing is it's called securitization, or they're talking about immigration in national security terms. So Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader in the House of Representatives, comes and gives this press conference along the border and suggests that not securing the border, if we've got more immigration, more people crossing the border, this could increase the risk of terrorism to the United States. This is an example of securitizing, making immigration a national security issue, which is designed to stoke fear and to build political support for tougher restrictions along the border. The other thing I think to realize in all of this is that in the aftermath of the big COVID bill passed by the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress without Republican support, it's clear from polling that lots of Republicans support that bill. And so Republicans have been a little bit divided on how to oppose and challenge the Biden administration. The border surge is an issue to unify Republican opposition, and so Republicans see real electoral benefits towards towards calling this a crisis, to highlighting the challenges that the Biden administration is facing, the potential risks to this growth in asylum requests, to try and generate traction and build support from the base in 2022 for upcoming midterm elections. And something else, we're going to talk about this in upcoming modules on immigration. Something to keep in mind in the back of your mind about all this is ultimately what also shapes the immigration debate in the United States is a question about how is the selectorate, or the number of voters, changing in the United States, right? And that's why the discussion about offering citizenship to undocumented individuals in the United States is so important, because citizenship brings voting rights. And so one of the underlying questions to all this is, what happens when and if these 10 to 11 million people start voting, which party they're going to support? And there's a real concern on the part of Republicans that they're going to support Democrats, which is also part of the resistance to increasing immigration into the United States. And so we want to finish today by talking, let's move a little bit away from domestic politics and talk about international politics. And the reason what we want to do here and emphasize, and we go back to the root cause discussion that we've already had, let's bring us back to some of the themes that we introduced really on the first day of this course, which is thinking systemically, right? And at its core, the international politics of this, we can trace this to globalization, trace this to the ability to the reduced costs of moving goods, services, and people around the globe. But what that also means is that this connects what goes on in the United States to what's going on in the rest of the world. And more importantly, and we need you to recognize this, what this means is that domestic conditions in Central America are necessarily shaping political outcomes and domestic conditions inside of the United States through immigration, right? And so what goes on in Central America ultimately reverberates back in the United States. This is about thinking systemically. And this also creates an interest on the part of the U.S. government, and we see this right now under both the Trump and the Biden administration. It creates an interest inside the United States and by the U.S. government. The U.S. needs to care about the political situation in these countries, because state failure, collapse, the takeover of their public societies by gangs creates pressure on the U.S. Southwestern border, which then influences domestic politics inside of the United States. And so we are connected with Central America, whether politicians want to recognize that or not. Right? And so what are some of these pressures, right? Why is this the case? Well, there are significant differences in income, economic growth, and public goods provision across the two regions, right? So we have higher wages in the United States. We have higher public goods provision associated with better governance in the United States, rule of law, protection from police services, from a judicial system, health services, education. Think about this in the context of COVID and the COVID vaccine. The U.S. has largely won the race to get a highly effective and safe COVID vaccinations to get passed on the other side of the pandemic. This is a function of educational quality, research quality, governance quality in the United States. better public goods provision. This creates incentives for people to want to migrate, to create a better lives for their family. And so given these imbalances in income and public goods provision, this creates huge push factors from Mexico and from Central America, people wanting to come to the United States. And we have significant state failure, right, in Central America associated with crime, cartels, and gangs. What all this means is the U.S. has an interest, right, and has to, if the U.S. wants to solve these problems associated with greater asylum requests, it has to solve it has to be part of the solution to the governance problems in these countries in Central America. Foreign aid might be a vehicle to do that. But at core, you've got to have cooperation with these countries. And I think it's important to realize that President Trump secured a lot of cooperation with the Mexican government for his Remain in Mexico program. There had to be cooperation there, and there was. It hasn't been talked as much about in the news media, but there was significant cooperation between the two administrations. And it's important to realize that Biden continues to rely on that cooperation that essentially pushes the problem of housing and taking care of these people. It puts more of the responsibility onto the Mexican government. And finally, right, a challenge for the United States is how do you encourage Central American governments to build greater government capacity, confront gangs, and supply public goods? This is a long-standing challenge, right? Because you have to do these things all at the same time while respecting their national sovereignty without generating backlash within these political systems against American intervention. So
and these are deep-seated problems. I mean, money isn't necessarily going to solve a state capacity problem by itself. And you can't simply say, well, we're just going to pump foreign aid into these countries and voila, their gang problem is going to go away. It's a pretty complicated problem to solve and help to solve. And so you're right that the real problem here is what's happening in Central America as the central push factor. But the United States solving that problem is a big lift.
Yeah, a big lift. Yeah. Right, and we should just add on the foreign aid issue that Rob just talked about, right? So if the governments are corrupt and you give them a bunch of foreign aid, who's the money going to flow to? Is it going to flow to the people that need it or not? So anyway, I'm looking at the time. We should probably be done here. If you have questions we're going to be continuing to talk about this immigration issue. We're going to have a later module on it. We might even come back to this on future news segments. But if you have questions, reach out to us during office hours or over Zoom. Otherwise, we'll see you next time at the news.